The dry Nevada air rolled across the Reno fairgrounds like a warning. Dust floated in the fading light, and one by one, the stadium lights flickered on. The kind that signaled more than just a rodeo. Tonight wasn't just another event on the circuit. It was a showdown. And somewhere behind the chutes, Dylan Hayes was preparing to face his reckoning. At just 24, Dylan had already made a name for himself on the national rodeo scene. A quiet, determined kid from Abilene, Texas, he'd grown up with boots too big for his feet, and a legend for a last name. His father, Caleb Hayes, had been a rodeo icon, until a fall in El Paso left him dead on the dirt when Dylan was just 9. Since then, the arena had always meant more than 8 seconds. It was where Dylan lost his hero, and where he planned to reclaim the legacy. He pulled on his vest with slow, deliberate movements, each strap a small ritual. The world outside buzzed with anticipation, the crowd chanting, the announcer hyping the match, vendors yelling over the music. But in Dylan's mind, everything was still. Focused. Tonight he'd ride Steelshot. The dry Nevada air rolled across the Reno fairgrounds like a warning. Dust floated in the fading light, and one by one, the stadium lights flickered on. The kind that signaled more than just a rodeo. Tonight wasn't just another event on the circuit. It was a showdown. And somewhere behind the chutes, Dylan Hayes was preparing to face his reckoning. At just 24, Dylan had already made a name for himself on the national rodeo scene. A quiet, determined kid from Abilene, Texas, he'd grown up with boots too big for his feet, and a legend for a last name. His father, Caleb Hayes, had been a rodeo icon, until a fall in El Paso left him dead on the dirt when Dylan was just 9. Since then, the arena had always meant more than 8 seconds. It was where Dylan lost his hero, and where he planned to reclaim the legacy. He pulled on his vest with slow, deliberate movements, each strap a small ritual. The world outside buzzed with anticipation, the crowd chanting, the announcer hyping the match, vendors yelling over the music. But in Dylan's mind, everything was still. Focused. Tonight he'd ride Steelshot. The name alone made seasoned riders flinch. Nearly 1,900 pounds of coiled fury, Steelshot had bucked off every man who dared sit on his back. He didn't just throw riders, he broke bones, shattered egos, and once sent a veteran to intensive care for a week. No one had lasted the full 8 seconds. Dylan wasn't just chasing a ride, he was chasing history. His fingers wrapped the bull rope tighter, chalk dust rising like smoke from a fire he was about to walk into. A longtime coach, one who'd known his father, rested a hand on his shoulder. "Tonight you ride for more than points," the man said. "You ride for your blood." Dylan nodded, barely breathing. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to pray, but to remember. His dad's crooked grin after a ride, the smell of dirt and leather in the trailer, the feeling of being 9 years old and invisible in the world of giants. A buzzer echoed in the distance. Another rider had just finished. Applause erupted, but Dylan heard none of it. His heart pounded in rhythm with the drums in his chest. Then came the voice over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, representing Abilene, Texas, riding the undefeated legend Steelshot, give it up for Dylan Hayes." The arena exploded in cheers. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stepped through the gate like a man walking into the heart of a storm, not knowing if he'd come out the other side, but knowing that whatever happened next, it would be remembered. If rodeo had a devil, its name was Steelshot. He wasn't just a bull, he was a force. A hulking black tornado of muscle, rage, and instinct. Riders didn't just fear him, they respected him like a hurricane on the horizon. Everyone who had ever dared climb on his back walked away with something broken. Some in the body, some in the soul. Steelshot wasn't born a legend. He earned it the hard way, one brutal buck at a time. Ranch hands in Oklahoma still told stories about how he broke 3 gates before he was even fully grown. His first appearance on the pro circuit left a man with a shattered collarbone and a fear of ever riding again. By the time he reached Reno, Steelshot was undefeated. He had bucked off 22 riders in a row, most in less than 5 seconds. They called him the Wall, because once you hit him, you didn't go through, you just fell. The announcers built him up like a monster in a Western tale. Fans wore shirts with his name. Kids begged for plush toy versions at the merch stand, not realizing the real Steelshot wasn't something you cuddled. He was something you survived. In the holding pen, just feet from where Dylan was getting ready, Steelshot paced like a predator sensing blood. His breath came in clouds. His hooves scraped the ground. His eyes, dark, wild, unblinking, locked onto every sound. Dylan knew those eyes. He'd studied every tape, every ride, every fall. He knew Steelshot's spun left hard on the first buck, that his third hop came with a twist violent enough to dislocate a man's shoulder. He'd visualized the ride 1,000 times. But watching him now, in real life inches away, it hit differently. This wasn't film. This was real. And it was terrifying. A fellow rider leaned over the gate and muttered, "You sure you still want to do this?" Dylan didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he couldn't afford to doubt. Not now. Not with cameras waiting. Not with the crowd chanting. Not with his mother in the stands, hands clenched, heart pounding like it did when his father rode. He exhaled. Slow. Focused. Like every bull he'd ever ridden was just a warm-up for this. Behind him, the announcer's voice rang out again, hyping the matchup as the ride of the year. Steelshot is a perfect 22-4-22 this season. Not a single man's lasted more than 6 seconds. But maybe, just maybe, tonight's the night we see history. The chute creaked open a few inches as handlers wrestled Steelshot into position. He bucked hard, slamming the metal, rattling everyone nearby. Even the announcer paused mid-sentence. Dylan didn't flinch, because fear had already visited him, and he'd made peace with it. This wasn't just about pride or trophies. This was personal. This was legacy. This was his father's unfinished ride, and it lived now in the body of a black beast named Steelshot. For Dylan Hayes, glory was never about fame. It was about finishing what his father started. Growing up in Abilene, Texas, Dylan didn't play Little League or dream about the NFL. He spent weekends chasing calves, mending fences, and watching old VHS tapes of his father's rides until the tape wore thin. Caleb Hayes was a legend, a cowboy's cowboy. But legends, Dylan would learn, die just like anyone else. His father's final ride ended not with a trophy, but with a crushed spine and a silent crowd in El Paso. Dylan was 9. He didn't cry at the funeral. Not in front of anyone. Instead, he snuck into the barn that night, curled up in his father's old saddle, and promised the stars above that one day he'd ride too. Not to replace his father, but to prove that the blood in his veins still meant something. That promise carried him through every broken rib, every busted lip, every rodeo where he walked away empty-handed. His mother hated it, every part of it. She worked double shifts at the diner to keep them afloat after Caleb died. She begged him to leave the rodeo behind, to go to college, to be anything but another boy chasing bulls and ghosts. But Dylan couldn't. He wasn't chasing death. He was chasing meaning. By 22, he'd already won 3 regional titles. Promoters started to notice. Sponsors sent boots and hats with his name embroidered on the side. But he always stayed grounded. No flash. No ego. Just grit. Then came the call, Reno. The biggest stage he'd ever set foot on. He didn't tell many people. Just his mom and Marcus, his best friend since middle school, now a bullfighter who worked the circuit too. When Dylan told him he'd be riding Steelshot, Marcus laughed like it was a joke. When he realized it wasn't, the laughter stopped. "You know he's never been ridden," Marcus said, serious now. "You know what happened to Ray Fuller last month?" "I know," Dylan replied. "That's why it has to be me." The ride wasn't just a challenge. It was a moment. A chance to take all the years of pain, all the sacrifices, and turn them into something immortal. His mom didn't say much the night before Reno. She just handed him a small, worn-down photo of Caleb in his prime, mid-ride, smiling like he had the world by the reins. Dylan slipped it into his shirt pocket, over his heart. "Ride like you've got nothing to prove and everything to give," she whispered. Now, standing behind the chute, seconds from facing Steelshot, Dylan could feel the weight of that promise. Not just the one he made to himself in a barn all those years ago, but the one he made to every person who ever believed in him. He wasn't just riding for 8 seconds. He was riding for everything. The gate burst open like a gunshot, and the world narrowed to a blur of hooves, dirt, and raw adrenaline. Dylan barely had time to adjust his grip before Steelshot exploded from the chute, bucking with a ferocity that felt like being strapped to a thunderstorm. The crowd roared as the black bull twisted, kicked, and spun, each movement a calculated attempt to shake him loose. 1 second. 2. 3. Dylan held on, boots tight against the flank, core locked, mind blank. There was no thinking now, only instinct, training, and pure heart. 4 seconds. Steelshot launched himself into the air, twisting mid-jump, landing like an earthquake. Dylan's body jolted. His arm slipped. 5. The bull spun left, Dylan's weaker side. He adjusted too late. 6. The rope burned through his glove. His fingers lost grip. And then he flew. Time slowed in that cruel, surreal way it does when something terrible is about to happen. Dylan's body, weightless for a moment, arced above the arena like a rag doll tossed by a violent child. He landed head first, neck snapping sideways on impact. His arms didn't reach out. His legs didn't move. He didn't get back up. The noise of the crowd collapsed into a deafening silence. You could hear a soda can drop from the stands. Even Steelshot, after a final snort, trotted off as if knowing the ride was over. And something far worse had begun. The arena staff ran first. Then the medics. The announcer's voice cracked mid-sentence. "Hold on, folks, we've got an injury." Injury. But those close to the scene saw more than that. Dylan wasn't moving. His chest barely rose. His fingers stayed limp. The bullfighters formed a wall around him, blocking the crowd from seeing too much. A cowboy dropped to his knees in the dirt, whispering prayers through gritted teeth. Marcus was already climbing over the fence, sprinting toward his friend. He had seen crashes before, bad ones. But this was different. Dylan wasn't moaning. He wasn't flinching. He just lay there. Quiet. Still. The medics stabilized his neck, strapped him to a backboard, lifted him into the waiting ambulance. The crowd, stunned, stayed seated. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. The arena that moments ago had vibrated with energy now pulsed with something else entirely: grief, fear, disbelief. Mothers hugged their kids tighter. Grown men removed their hats and bowed their heads. Marcus stood at the gate, fists clenched, tears welling. This was supposed to be Dylan's night. His glory. His legacy. Instead, all that remained was a deep impression in the dirt, and a question hanging in the air like smoke. Did we just watch a dream die? The silence was louder than any cheer could have been. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, the flashing red lights cast long shadows over the dirt, shadows that seemed to swallow the entire arena. Steelshot had already been led back to his pen, snorting and stomping, unaware of the wreckage he'd left behind. But all eyes stayed locked on the spot where Dylan Hayes had fallen. Still, lifeless, unmoving. The crowd didn't move either. People sat in stunned silence, programs clutched in their hands like prayer books. A few whispered. Others stared down at the arena floor, as if expecting Dylan to walk back out and wave, to let them all off the emotional hook. But he didn't, because Dylan wasn't coming back out. Behind the scenes, paramedics worked with terrifying precision. Oxygen mask, cervical collar, monitors. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the announcer's mic had gone dead. The music stopped. The energy in the arena didn't just drop, it vanished. Marcus stood just outside the medical tent, pacing like a caged animal. His hands trembled. He'd seen bull riders take hits before. Hell, he'd taken a few himself. Broken ribs, concussions, fractured wrists, that came with the job. But this wasn't that. Dylan hadn't blinked since the fall. Hadn't moved his fingers. Hadn't made a sound. A veteran cowboy walked by and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Some rides change your career," he said quietly. "Some change your life." The words hit like a hammer. Inside the tent, Dylan's mother sat by his side. She had arrived in Reno just that morning, excited, nervous, holding on to the hope that this would be her son's moment. But now, her hands trembled as she stroked his hair, eyes fixed on the monitors that beeped with cruel consistency. She whispered his name. He didn't answer. She squeezed his hand. He didn't squeeze back. Outside, the rodeo officials huddled. After a few tense minutes, the announcer's mic cracked back to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, the remainder of tonight's program has been suspended." Gasps. A few sobs. But still no applause. The crowd began to rise slowly, unsure of how to react. No chants. No music. Just the soft crunch of boots on gravel as people filed out in silence. Haunted by the image of a young cowboy who had flown through the air like a hero and hit the ground like a warning. In the hallway, Marcus leaned against the concrete wall and slid down to the floor, head in his hands. He wasn't thinking about bull stats or tour standings or what this meant for the rest of the season. He was thinking about Dylan's voice, about the laugh that always came after a close call, about the time he said, "If I ever go down hard, don't let him turn me into a damn statue." But right now, Dylan wasn't a statue. He was a fallen brother. And for the first time in his life, Marcus didn't know if he'd ever hear that laugh again. There are moments when the noise of the world simply dies. As Dylan was wheeled out of the arena under the harsh glare of emergency lights, there was no standing ovation, no triumphant music, no cowboy fist raised in victory. Only a cold, bitter hush, like the soul had been sucked out of Reno Rodeo itself. The crowd, thousands deep, remained in their seats. No one clapped. No one shouted. They just watched, stunned, as the ambulance doors closed and the flashing lights disappeared into the Nevada night. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral without a casket. In the front row, a little boy wearing a plastic cowboy hat turned to his father, confused. "Daddy, is he going to be okay?" The father didn't answer. Behind the chutes, the other riders stood frozen. Men who had faced down bulls, broken bones, and brushed off fear for a living, now stood with their hats clutched to their chests. Some prayed. Some wept. And Marcus, Dylan's best friend, his rodeo brother, leaned against the arena gate, eyes red, jaw clenched. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Dylan had always joked that if he ever went down, he wanted fireworks, not silence. "Make and play Johnny Cash loud enough to raise me from the dead," he'd said with that crooked grin. But there was no cash. No tribute. Just the sound of a flag flapping in the dry desert wind. Later that night, while the stadium emptied and trucks rumbled back onto the highway, a group of riders gathered in the dirt where Dylan had fallen. They drew a small circle with their boots. No words were said. Just a shared look, the kind only cowboys understand. One rider, older, grizzled, walked to the center of that circle. He dropped a folded bandana in the dirt. "For the ones who ride hard and fall harder," he said. The others nodded. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dylan's mother sat in the ICU waiting room, eyes fixed on a vending machine that hadn't worked since 2009. Her hands trembled, still dirty from the arena dust. She'd been there, close enough to see the moment her son's body hit the ground, but too far to reach him before the medics took over. She had screamed his name once, a scream that never made it past the roar of the crowd. Now there was only silence. Back at the arena, cleanup crews began tearing down the banners. Steelshot's name still hung from the rafters, undefeated champion. But no one looked up at it, because this night wasn't about a bull. It was about a boy who had given everything for 8 seconds, and lost more than anyone had imagined. No one knew yet how bad the damage was. But deep down, everyone felt it. Something had shifted. And when the Reno Rodeo returned the next day, the crowd was a little quieter. The cheers a little softer. Because the memory of Dylan Hayes, that fall, that stillness, that silence, still echoed in the dust. The hospital room was too bright. White walls. Sharp smells. Machines that beeped like broken clocks. Dylan Hayes lay still in the bed, eyes open but unmoving, as if stuck somewhere between the world he knew and a new, colder one that didn't yet have a name. His mother sat by the bed, her hands clutching his. She whispered stories, half prayers, half memories, anything to keep him anchored. But Dylan didn't speak. He didn't move, just blinked once in a while slowly, like a man learning how to live again, second by second. It took 3 days for the doctors to deliver the words. And when they didn't sugarcoat it. Complete spinal cord injury at C4. He won't walk again. He may never breathe on his own. He's paralyzed from the neck down. The words hit like a wrecking ball. The doctor said it with clinical precision, as if detachment made it easier. But nothing could soften that blow. Not for his mother. Not for Marcus, who sat slumped against the hospital hallway, fists clenched and jaw locked. And not for Dylan, who heard it all. He was awake, and fully aware of what those words meant. A rodeo cowboy, trained to fall and get back up, was now facing the one fall he couldn't rise from. For the next week, Reno buzzed with speculation. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines read like obituaries. Rising star crushed in Reno. Steelshot claims another. Social media flooded with tributes, photos, memories, strangers calling Dylan a hero, a fighter, a legend. But Dylan didn't feel like any of those things. He felt like a body, a burden, a man stuck inside a shell that wouldn't move. He hated the tubes, hated the way the nurses looked at him with pity, hated the way his mom tried to smile like it wasn't killing her inside. And most of all, he hated the silence of limbs that wouldn't respond, the silence of dreams that once shouted, now reduced to a whisper he couldn't reach. When Marcus visited, he tried to joke. "You always said you wanted a break from the circuit," he said with a weak laugh. Dylan blinked once. No smile. Then, in a voice barely audible through the breathing tube, he asked, "Am I still a cowboy?" Marcus didn't know what to say. How do you answer that? How do you tell your best friend, the guy who bled beside you in dirt arenas across the country, that the one thing he lived for was now out of reach? You don't. You just sit beside him. You hold his hand. You cry when he can't see you. And you promise, even if you don't believe it yourself, that this isn't the end. that there's still something left to fight for. That being a cowboy has never been just about the ride. Denver felt cold, not just from the snow-dusted mountains outside, but from the sterile, mechanical quiet of the rehab hospital where Dylan Hayes now lived. He was no longer in Reno, no longer in the rodeo, no longer the man who climbed into the chute with fire in his chest. Now, every morning began with a nurse checking his ventilator settings and a physical therapist moving his arms for him, one slow, stiff inch at a time. This wasn't recovery. This was survival. And even that was fragile. Dylan couldn't breathe on his own for more than a few minutes. His lungs, once powerful enough to scream through dust and wind, now worked with the help of machines that beeped and clicked and whispered his every breath. Every time the ventilator paused, even for a second, panic would rise, as if his body was forgetting how to stay alive. But the fight wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. Every inch of progress came at the price of 100 private battles. The kind that no one applauded. The kind that didn't make headlines. His mother never left his side. Nancy Hayes had always been tough, a Texas woman who raised a son alone and taught him how to take a hit. But nothing had prepared her for this. She slept in a recliner beside his bed. She learned how to suction his throat. She memorized every beep, every alarm. And she never let him see her cry. Dylan, though, could feel the weight in her silence. The way she paused before answering. The way her fingers lingered on his forehead just a second longer than they used to. One afternoon, as a therapist tried to help him sit upright for the first time, Dylan gasped, struggling for air. The machine whined. The nurse reached for the oxygen valve. Nancy grabbed his hand. "Breathe with me, baby," she whispered. "Just breathe." And he did. Barely. That night, she read aloud from an old rodeo magazine, the one that had first featured Dylan in a Spotlight article. She read it with a trembling voice, pausing at the line where the journalist had written, "He rides like he was born in the dust and baptized in fire." When she looked up, Dylan was staring at the ceiling. His voice came weak but clear. "That guy's gone." She shook her head. "No, he's not. He's just learning a new ride." There were no crowds here. No boots stomping. No country music pumping from the speakers. But there was still a cowboy in that room. One who woke up every day, looked at the mountain he couldn't climb, and tried anyway. Because sometimes courage isn't about getting back on the bull. Sometimes it's about learning to breathe again, and choosing to live when everything hurts. The headlines came faster than Dylan could blink. From rodeo star to tragedy survivor. The cowboy who fell and rose. Dylan Hayes, the face of courage. Every outlet had a story. They showed photos of his rides, interviews with childhood friends, dramatic footage of his fall, slowed down, looped, picked apart like a scene from a war film. Journalists called from New York, from LA, from Dallas. Networks wanted exclusives. Brands offered sponsorships. Documentaries were pitched. And through it all, Dylan stayed quiet. Not because he was overwhelmed. Because he hated it. He hated what they were turning him into. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't an inspiration. He was a man who fell. A man who woke up every day in a body that no longer obeyed him. A man who couldn't scratch his nose without help. They made it look noble. He felt humiliated. In one interview, a reporter asked, "Do you feel proud of what you represent now?" Dylan stared at her deadpan. "I used to represent someone who finished the ride." The video went viral. People called him brave for being raw, for telling the truth. But they didn't understand. They never could. They saw courage. He saw loss. Marcus visited often, bringing news from the circuit, videos from old friends, stories from the road. They'd sit for hours, mostly in silence, sometimes watching old rodeo clips. One day, Marcus played a video of Dylan's first win, Amarillo, 3 years earlier. The kid in the clip was lean, wild-eyed, full of fire. He shouted into the sky after the 8-second buzzer like he'd just touched the edge of God. Dylan turned away. "I miss him," he said softly. Marcus replied, "He's still here." But Dylan didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure if that was true anymore. The rehab center had a therapy room where patients could will up to a fake horse, a mechanical rig designed to simulate balance and coordination. The staff suggested Dylan try it. He refused. Every time. "I'm not a damn mascot," he told them. What haunted him most wasn't the pain or the stillness. It was the storyline, the myth people were building around him. They spoke like his life had climaxed, and now he was just the postscript. The symbol. The sad, noble cowboy in the wheelchair. But Dylan didn't want to be a myth. He wanted to be a man again. A man who mattered not for what he endured, but for what he could still build, still fight for, still live. And somewhere deep inside, a thought began to grow. Quiet, faint, but stubborn. If they're going to write my story, maybe I should be the one to finish it. Steelshot kept bucking. While Dylan Hayes lay in a rehab bed, learning how to breathe and speak again, the beast that changed his life was back on the circuit. Undefeated, untamed, unbothered. Rodeos across the country still promoted Steelshot as the main attraction. The bull no man can ride. Crowds cheered when the gate burst open and Steelshot stormed into the arena, muscles rippling, fury in every leap. For fans, he was entertainment, a living spectacle, a legend. But for Dylan, Steelshot had become something else. A ghost, a trigger, a wound with horns. One afternoon, while flipping through channels in the therapy room, Dylan landed on a live rodeo broadcast. He froze when the announcer's voice boomed. And next up, the reigning king of the circuit. Steelshot. The camera cut to the chute. The same chute Dylan had once gripped with white knuckles and burning lungs. A young rider, no older than 20, was climbing onto Steelshot's back. Nervous. Green. Eager. Dylan couldn't look away. He watched every second. The gate swing open, the beast launch into the dirt, the boy hold on for dear life. 4 seconds. 5. 6. Then the bull twisted violently. The rider flew. The thud of his body hitting the ground echoed through the broadcast. He didn't get up right away. Dylan's heart stopped. The silence was familiar, terrifyingly so. But this time the rider moved. Slowly. Staggered to his feet. The crowd roared in relief. Dylan didn't. He couldn't. His hands clenched the sides of his chair. His jaw locked. Sweat broke across his forehead. A nurse noticed. "Are you okay, Dylan?" He nodded once. But inside, he was unraveling. That fall was his fall. That arena was his graveyard. Steelshot wasn't just a bull anymore. He was the face of everything Dylan had lost. The life before, the body before, the identity before. And the world still cheered for him. Still applauded the wreckage he left behind. That night, Dylan lay awake longer than usual. The beeps of the ventilator matched his racing thoughts. Somewhere, another kid would ride that bull. And maybe fall. And maybe never get up. And the rodeo would go on. Because that's how it works. But something inside Dylan began to shift. He couldn't ride again. But maybe, just maybe, he could warn them. Guide them. Protect them. He wasn't a rider anymore. But he was still a cowboy. And a cowboy never walks away from the fire just because he got burned. He finds a way back. Even if it's not on horseback. 1 year later, the Reno Rodeo sold out faster than it ever had. But this time, the crowd wasn't just coming for bulls. They were coming for him. The air in the arena crackled with anticipation. It wasn't the usual kind. Not the thrill before a ride, not the tension before the gate opened. This was something quieter. Heavier. The kind of energy reserved for moments that matter more than wins or stats. At the entrance tunnel, the dust settled as a familiar voice rang over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the Reno Rodeo, Dylan Hayes." Silence. And then thunder. The crowd rose to their feet, a wave of people clapping, shouting, crying. Some held signs. Others tipped their hats. Cameras flashed from every corner. But Dylan, wheeled into the arena by Marcus, didn't wave. Didn't cry. He just looked around, steady, grounded, and breathed it all in. For the first time in 12 months, he was back in the dirt. Back where it all began. Where everything had ended. And where something new was about to start. The spotlight followed him to center arena. There was no bull this time. No rope. No 8-second clock ticking. Just a mic. And a man with something to say. Marcus locked the brakes on the chair. Dylan took a moment, then leaned forward to the microphone. His voice came low at first, dry, cracked, but grew with each word. "A year ago, I rolled into this arena thinking I'd make history. I did. Just not the way I planned." The crowd held their breath. "I don't remember the moment I fell. But I remember the silence after. I remember the fear. The anger. The pain. And I remember thinking my life was over. A pause. But it wasn't. Murmurs. Tears. Stillness. See, I always thought being a cowboy meant holding on for 8 seconds. But I've learned something since then. Being a cowboy means holding on no matter what. Applause. Louder this time. Stronger. I may never walk again. But I still fight. I still breathe. I still live. And I came back here tonight to tell you, I'm still standing. Maybe not on my feet. But damn it, I'm still standing." The stadium erupted. Not with sympathy. Not with pity. With respect. Real deep soul-level respect. In the stands, his mother sobbed into her hands. Riders hugged. Veterans removed their hats. Even the toughest cowboys had wet eyes. Because they weren't just looking at a survivor. They were looking at a man who had rewritten the meaning of courage, right there, in the same dirt that tried to bury him. And as the spotlight faded and Dylan turned to leave, the crowd chanted just one word. Cowboy! 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 He didn't need a saddle anymore. He didn't need a rope. He had something stronger now, a voice, a message, a mission. And it all started here, right where it almost ended. There was a time when Dylan Hayes believed his entire life would be measured in 8 seconds. 8 seconds of adrenaline. 8 seconds of pain. 8 seconds of glory. But as he watched a child in a wheelchair climb onto a mechanical bull in a rehab center in Austin, gripping the handle with trembling fingers and a fierce little smile, he realized something powerful. His real ride had only just begun. It started quietly, a letter here, a message there. Injured athletes reaching out. Families asking for advice. Parents of kids with spinal injuries wondering what came next. And Dylan, with nothing but a voice, started answering. He didn't have all the answers. But he had truth. And people listened. What began as conversations turned into a movement. With help from Marcus, his mother, and a small circle of friends, Dylan launched the Hayes Foundation, an initiative that provided resources, mental health support, and adaptive sports programs for athletes who had suffered life-altering injuries. It wasn't charity. It was cowboy grit in action. He spoke at schools, at military bases, at rodeo halls and sports clinics. Each time, the message was the same. You don't need legs to stand for something. His voice, once silenced by trauma, now echoed louder than any 8-second cheer ever could. Steelshot retired a year later. Dylan didn't flinch at the news. By then, the bull was no longer a symbol of pain. He was part of the story, a chapter that no longer defined the whole book. And what a book it was becoming. The boy who once dreamed of riding like his father had become something more. A builder of legacies, not just a bearer of them. In one of the final scenes of a documentary about his life, Dylan is shown watching a rodeo from the sidelines. The camera pans to his face, calm, proud, and full of quiet fire. Next to him, a young girl in a chair asks, "Do you miss it?" He thinks for a second, then smiles. "I don't miss the ride. I miss who I was. But now, I like who I'm becoming." Fade to black. Because in the end, Dylan Hayes wasn't remembered for his fall. He was remembered for what he did after. He proved that real courage doesn't live in the spotlight. It lives in the quiet mornings, the painful steps, the choices we make after the world stops cheering. He showed us that some rides last 8 seconds. But the ones that truly matter, they last a lifetime.